All right, thank you everyone for coming. This is our fourth talk here, or yeah, third, I guess. Yeah, so I just want to introduce Tal real quick. So pretty much Tal, I've had the pleasure of working with Tal for the past couple quarters, but just a quick intro. Right now, he's a software engineer at a recently acquired reverse logistics startup, and pretty much so senior software engineer. And his expertise is in the field of machine learning. And I guess I'll let him explain what he's going to talk about. But pretty much it seems to be, I mean, not it seems to be, but pretty much I think he's going to talk about how to, in the past, I'll let you explain. So I just want to say thank you, Tal, for taking out this time in your Saturday. I know we all treasure our Saturdays, so we especially appreciate you taking out this time with us here. Yeah, actually, we don't appreciate you regardless of whenever you take time. It doesn't matter the time. We always appreciate it.
I love to do it.
You've done a lot for this community, so thank you. And without further ado, I'll just pass it on to you so you can explain better. Get started.
Sounds good. So I'm Tal Globus. I'm currently a software engineer, as mentioned, at a reverse logistics startup, which fortunately enough was recently acquired. And I'm also a volunteer mentor / instructor of sorts at the Developers Guild on the machine learning group. And I started doing that in late 2019. We've had quite a few quarters at this point. There were some great lessons that we learned out of it, and some that I hope can be useful to you guys as you either embark on your machine learning journey or are learning to code, or really I shove the thing full of productivity hacks. So on just about anything you guys want to learn. That's kind of the purpose of the talk, and I'll go a little deeper into that in a bit. But first, and this is, the slide's a bit of a joke, but it is a very important note. I am a software engineer at an established company. That being said, I'm here representing only myself. Please do not misconstrue my words as representing those of any company, associated with me or not. Just me. So that being said, this talk is going to be broken down into 4 rough sections, of which we are in the first. So we're going to start out by kind of introducing the talk and giving some general principles that are going to be useful throughout. Then we're going to talk to some of the common mistakes that are made by people getting started with machine learning, as well as getting started on basically any motivation demanding endeavor. And then we're going to go through some habits that have proven very successful in people who've made it out the other side of the AI group at DG. And then finally, we're going to take all the things that in the previous sections, which are kind of applicable to basically any subject, and we're going to apply those specifically to ML and what that can do for you. So to start off. Now, the purpose of this talk, first of all, I want to motivate you guys, because of course I do. But second of all, I want to be realistic. And I think that a lot of people who are having this kind of conversation make the mistake of being, like overly flowery when it comes to how easy something's going to be. And then people get started and they get really disappointed and they get scared away. That is not the point of this. I really don't want you guys to be scared away, but part of that means being, frankly, kind of blunt when it comes to what the process is actually going to look like. So motivate with realism. And then as for what that actually looks like as applied to the talk, it's basically productivity advice and some hacks, meeting machine learning. And so this is, kind of the summary of, the message that I'm trying to get across, if you will. So to start off, kind of my philosophy as I go about, teaching ML and giving this talk is, really summable down to, 2 words is just be honest with you guys, tell you exactly what it's going to be, the good parts, the bad parts. And, so far that's proven very effective in several quarters of, the AI group at DG. And I'm hoping it's going to be effective with you guys as well. So to start off with general principles, kind of the one general principle to rule them all here is metacognition. This is probably the single most important thing that's useful for motivation and productivity in general, and definitely applies when you're working on learning to code, learning ML. It's we tend to go through learning processes kind of blindly, and that turns out to be oftentimes not necessarily a mistake, but something that can do with some more optimization. right? So as it happens, all of you guys think in a certain way and you learn in a certain way. And if you learn how you learn and learn how you think, and you start to analyze that, then you can oftentimes build routines that are more effective. You can find, as an example, which I would hope would be quite relevant to most of you here, more effective ways of studying, more effective ways of learning, more effective ways of not feeling, demotivated or scared away by a given topic. And so a lot of what we're going to discuss today kind of falls under the general principle of take something that, oh, wow, this lighting is terrible. Is take something that you've kind of taken, for granted or not necessarily thought through up until now, and just working to think through it a bit deeper. So to start, motivation is variable. And by that, I mean, it applies to everyone differently, and it's something that can be optimized for. And rather than just kind of assuming that it'll be there sometimes and hoping for the best, pay attention to when you feel motivated, pay attention to what motivates you, and pay attention to the styles of work or learning that for you seem most sustainable. And if you do that and you constantly work on essentially just paying attention and then acting based on what you notice, then you can improve. Now, as an example of this, something I'd like to bring up right up front is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is, you feel yourself being, you want to work on something. You don't need anyone else pushing you to do it. You'll just do it on your own because that's what you want to be doing with your time. Extrinsic motivation is when you have something else that is kind of driving you, right? Grades are a prime example. Now, the key point here is that when you have extrinsic motivation, you don't need as much intrinsic motivation, right? You study for a test, not because you necessarily care about the subject matter, but because you're getting a grade. When you're not being graded on something, you need a lot more intrinsic motivation. You need to find some other way to motivate yourself. And one of the big things that we've noticed in people attending the AI group at DG is that they will assume that the level of motivation that they will have as a baseline getting started on the group will be roughly equivalent to that of a class, which turns out to be an incorrect assumption. Why? Because it's not being graded, right? We don't give you a grade, and frankly, you didn't pay a whole bunch of money in order for the privilege of sitting in the class. And what that means is you have to find other things to motivate you, and you have to be expected to be less motivated as a baseline. And then finally, learning style is also a variable, right? So everyone learns in a different way. Hopefully this is somewhat obvious. And by the way, some of this stuff, if you find that a lot of this material is obvious, it means you're in a good place right now. But learning style will change from person to person. Figure out what works for you and then make more and more and more of that. So as a final kind of general concept here to express the difficulty of, I would say learning or sticking to anything. Your progress distance is equal to your rate times your time, basic physics formula, but really important here. What that means is if you want to go very far in something, you either have to be willing to move very, very fast, or you have to be willing to stick to it for a long time. There is no such thing as getting distance without either moving fast or sticking to it for a while. Or to put it a different way, there's no free lunch. And this applies to everything, including, high school physics, of course. So it's a good thing to pay attention to and a good thing to keep in mind because it keeps you from having unrealistic expectations when it comes to how easy or how fast something's going to be. Which leads us into, our first of kind of 4 question sessions here. So between each of the 4, kind of sections of this, we're going to put a few minutes for you guys to have questions. People don't always feel comfortable putting questions in the middle of a talk, but we've noticed that if we wait until the end, then people forget all the stuff at the beginning. So if you guys have any questions, now is a good time, and we're going to have a few minutes for this. And there will be 3 more of these throughout. So anything so far?
Just before I will stop recording. So if you guys don't feel uncomfortable, if you guys feel uncomfortable while in the recording, I can feel free to stop it, and you guys can ask your questions then. So yeah.
I just realized that I made your life so difficult by forcing you to piece together 4 bits of this.
No, it does it by itself. If you pause, then it'll be by itself. Yeah. Well, okay. Now
let's keep going. So now on to most common mistakes. So these are mistakes that we have seen people make repeatedly at the group as they're trying to learn. And they're mistakes that if no one made, we would probably have a much, much higher success rate. Not that we don't have a pretty okay one to begin with. So first of all, if you haven't heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's a thing. What you're looking at is a graph that basically shows you your confidence with time or with experience as you learn a new subject. This has been verified by studies up to and including the one cited right there in the graphic. Essentially, what tends to happen when people start a thing is that they expect that the start is going to be very difficult. And then they find that the start is relatively easy. And then they start to expect that the entire thing is going to be very easy. But then things get really hard. And then suddenly their confidence drops and people get scared away. This is probably the single most common reason why people, give up on a new endeavor overall, which is saying something. Now, my personal theory is if you know to expect this, you know that this is something that you're going to feel and you know to anticipate it, then you can, when it comes, you'll expect it and you'll be able to handle it. So to start, if this isn't obvious, machine learning is not a quick and easy thing to learn. In general, to go from having reasonable skill in Python, but no skill in machine learning to being able to, let's say, put together a basic solution for most Kaggle problems is probably on the order of like 3 to 9 months with like a normal amount of commitment. For people who can commit more, it's obviously less and vice versa. But that is the expectation. If you expect to start on a thing and then it'll be, like within a week, you'll be competing with, that algorithm that made someone a whole bunch of money from Netflix a few years ago. Expectations. So that's fast and easy. Second thing, second big mistake is, and kind of a concept I'd like you to be aware of is your consumption versus production ratio. This is an element of basically everything you learn, and it's a common area of making mistakes. So consumption is, let's say, reading or watching videos, or in other way, basically taking in information without actually creating something, right? This tends to be the way that most people lean towards learning. Now, production, on the other hand, is, let's say, putting together, like building a project or, using what you've learned in some sort of way. Now, basically, any activity you can do is going to be a mix of both of these things. But keep in mind, and that this is one of those areas where human intuition tends to strongly disagree with how we actually learn. So passive learning is a big problem. People tend to start out, and I get to use like 12-year-old memes, which is great. So people tend to, let's say, start watching a whole bunch of machine learning videos on YouTube, or they tend to find like blog posts or articles or tutorials, and they spend lots and lots of time reading along reading along or watching along and expect to become experts in that way. And I used to be kind of right in that same boat. The somewhat controversial opinion that I've adopted over time is that passive learning just doesn't really work. And I'm sure there are people who will disagree with me. But what seems to work the best, at least for the AI group at DG, is getting into building things, getting started on building things fast, and kind of moving away from learning quickly. And then, as opposed to kind of starting with consuming and continuing to consume and feel accomplished from the consumption, start on projects, run into things that you're blocked on, and then learn enough to fill in those blocks. And so allow the things that you don't know as discovered by the projects you pursue to drive what you learn. So it's always back to the project, right? Project, and then let's say you don't know something, you go out and learn it, you come back to the project. You run into another like roadblock, you go out and learn it, you go back to the project. This tends to guarantee that you have progression, as opposed to kind of, like, let's be honest, YouTube is infinite. Like there's literally, like, video is being uploaded at a much, much faster rate than it can be watched. Which means if you expect to learn from watching videos, you're going to spend a very long time watching videos and may not end up anywhere. So the general progression of material from worst to best here is kind of videos, and then reading tends to be a little bit better because you tend to have to process a little more what you're reading as opposed to videos, which are much more, I guess, self-complete. And then follow along manual coding. So what this means is, let's say someone's walking you through a project, and then they're building the project, and they have you, writing code along with it. Then there's some production in there, so it tends to be more useful. Obviously, the more code you write yourself, the better it works. And then finally, working on challenges. Something like Haggle comes to mind, or LeetCode if you are in the learning coding game. That stuff works great, and I wish more people started with it. Next mistake that people make is diving into the math too soon. So this is correct. This is like all this math is accurate. This is from Andrew Ng's at this point, pretty famous Coursera course on machine learning from when he was teaching at Stanford. It is absolutely true, and also entirely useless when you were learning the field. Now, just look at this for a second and ask yourself, does this motivate you? Does this make you feel like something that you want to learn? If you are like most people, the answer is probably not. But furthermore, it's demotivating and it's unhelpful. It's almost distracting, right? Because let's be honest, and this is something that you'll learn fairly quickly as you dive into learning machine learning, is that the tools will do this for you. I mean, you can learn all this later if you want to, but trust the tools to do the math, and then focus on the abstract concepts. Learn with it the highest level of abstraction that you can, and you'll tend to make much faster progress and be much happier doing it. In other words, stay away from all of this. Next, and this is kind of a general point and something we hear a lot, and it's not something like I'm trying to judge, but it's an important thing to point out, which is everything that you do within your life fits into the same period of 24 hours. Everything that everyone does with their life fits into the same period of 24 hours. So perception of how much time you have to do something really indicates your implicit priorities, right? If you think you don't have time for something, it generally indicates that you're not prioritizing it. Now, granted, there are definitely endeavors that take a lot more time than others. But the I don't have time tends to be kind of a misleading justification rather than a reason for what you spend your time on. Now, the important lesson to pull away from this is just be careful with your use of time, right? Choose the things that matter to you. Spend your time on those things, not ridiculously complicated. So we've had successful students who taught themselves ML while full-time students with jobs. I would say from what we've seen in general, based on 2 years of doing this, if you want to make really good progress and get to a really, really good place, 30 minutes a day is a very good starting point. If you can't do 30 minutes a day, you can still make very good progress and be in a very good place with 30 minutes twice a week or so. That's really the commitment, the only commitment that you have to make, and up to you if you're willing to or want to do it. Next thing, and this is kind of a general motivation point, is expecting to feel motivated later. This is a great quote from Cormac McCarthy. I think most of us, myself included, find ourselves in this place of waiting for motivation to pursue something. Now the pattern that you tend to realize, especially as you get a bit older, is that the motivation doesn't create itself. It's not a spontaneous thing. You'll have maybe somewhere between 5 and 15 days a year where you just feel inherently inspired, but 5 and 15 days a year is not going to get you anywhere with any endeavor. And so if you're depending on that, then you are going to fail at whatever you do. There's also a great quote by Andrew Carnegie. I believe he said, those who are unable to motivate themselves must be content with mediocrity. The fact is, expect things to be difficult, expect to have to spend time working on them when you don't want to, and you will have a much more reasonable expectation of how things will actually play out. Okay, so that's the end of our second section about mistakes. Do we have any questions on the mistakes section? Let's do it. So next up is habits of successful learners. I think I had more notes on this one. Oh, that's right. So in all seriousness though, you really want to kind of move away from this pre-learning before you start doing things phase and getting into the doing things phase much quicker. This is really kind of just a general restatement of the consumption production ratio. which is, kind of leading back to general mistakes, is people tend to divide the time that they spend honing a craft or learning a skill between kind of the initial learning and then the practice. And people almost invariably spend too much time on the initial learning and not enough time on the practice. And so the biggest thing that we found is very helpful for teaching ML, and I've also found to be very helpful when learning languages as well as a few other skills, is you want to dive into doing things very, very fast, much faster than you feel comfortable with. And generally it will, I've seen basically no one dive too deeply into starting to do things, though I've seen several quarters worth of students dive to spend just far too long kind of pre-studying before they feel comfortable doing things. So piece of advice number one is start doing very fast. And kind of as a bit of a reasoning behind this, also we found that even though people don't tend to realize this consciously, not doing is demotivating. Because what tends to happen is you get a sort of a momentary dose of instant gratification from your learning, but that doesn't generally translate into learning, because as we said before, controversial point, passive learning doesn't work, which means that you get your instant gratification, but then you don't actually feel that you're learning over time. And that, that dissonance turns into frustration, and that frustration turns into demotivation. So, kind of reasoning behind why doing first is a much better approach. One very helpful mechanism for this, which is something that we're now adopting with the AI group at DG, something that I've used for my own skills that I want to improve, is to find a series of challenges to work on that build on each other and gradually increase in difficulty. So think of it like you want to learn a language, and so you commit to having a short conversation at a store where you buy something, right? Something nice and simple. And then you gradually increase the difficulty, especially building on the same context. With machine learning, the example would be you find some kind of overarching project, you break it down into a few phases, and then you design the phases so that the first one is easy and accomplishable, as soon as possible. And they kind of get more and more difficult progressively at a very gradual pace over time. The goal here is to A, control your motivation, B, to make your motivation be roughly proportional to your actual amount of learning that you've achieved so far. And C is just because so people get demotivated by very large and kind of amorphous tasks. If you break something down into steps, you can find that you build something or accomplish something much bigger than you anticipated, while having it broken down into, let's say, 8 phases, each a week long. Now, make them short, at least at the start, though we'll expand on this a bit later, and easy to progress on. You want to be able to make progress very quickly. And remember that winning, when I say wins, I mean making progress in general is motivating. One mistake people can make, though, is getting stuck on making progress at things that aren't actually learning, or making progress at things that aren't actually accomplishing anything. Or let's say copying and pasting code as an example that applies to the case at hand. When something is easier than it should be, it seems that we have some kind of intuition around this, and people get demotivated. Which is why I say wins are motivating unless they're unrealistically easy. Next here is to try to identify and eliminate blockers. So there are 2 types of blockers. There are internal blockers and external blockers. And this is my terminology, by the way. An internal blocker means that you are dependent on something that you yourself cannot yet do. And in this case, generally what it means is you just need to learn something. External blockers is, let's say you are waiting for a student subscription, or like a student discount on a service that you want to use, and you use this as a reasoning not to get started. External blockers are almost always a bad thing, which is why while people don't tend to think of blockers and bifurcate them in this way, dividing blockers into internal and external and focusing on eliminating the external kind is very, very useful. Because you cannot force the external world to move at your pace, but you can force yourself to move at your pace. And as for internal blockers, asking lots of questions is generally the resolution. Just when you find that there's something you can't do, that's when you go out and learn something. Next up, something that we haven't used enough in DG, we used to use it more, and there's another group that actually uses this to a much, better rate of success, is group accountability. So if you've ever wondered why people who jog and jog consistently will often jog in groups, the reason is no one in the group actually wants to be jogging. Everyone wants to stop, but you don't want to be the first guy to stop and embarrasses yourself in front of your friends. And so everyone continues jogging because they're surrounded by people, and kind of, judgment almost becomes a motivating tool, right? Now you can turn this to your advantage by building up, things that you have to do into group activities where everyone's being implicitly motivated by everyone around them to keep making progress. One example of this is if you have a project where everyone's very clear on what other people are doing. People are, especially if the majority of the group is making baseline progress, then the one person who isn't making progress feels embarrassed, and they make sure that that doesn't happen. So group accountability is a really, really good tool. I would take deep advantage of it if you can. And there are, a number of resources you can use that will help you use this as a tool in your everyday life. One that I've adopted, there's actually a website called FocusMate that I really like for, when you have to work on things that you don't want to work on. Basically, you pick a time slot, and they will find someone else who has to work on something that they don't want to work on during the same time. And it's literally just a video chat, or like a video running in the background. So every time you look up, the other person's there. And you know that if you step away, then you're going to be very embarrassed. And so you don't step away and you stay on task. And so, basically the lesson here is take advantage of group accountability, especially if you're competitive, because it works and it's a vastly underutilized tool. Next is, so one habit that a lot of people, myself included, get into is you decide, hey, I'm going to change up my routine. I'm going to make some grand, very difficult plan that I'm then going to stick to for the next year. Ahem, New Year's resolutions. Yes, so you make some grand plan, and then you fall off the wagon, and then you just lost your goal, right? You make your entire goal implicitly dependent on a very hard plan, and then you don't allow yourself to replan it. Now, classic example of this is how many people sign up for gyms at the beginning of the year, and then how many people don't show up to gyms come February or March. Now, one trick that I found to be very useful personally, and we've also found to be useful in the limited cases where we've applied it in DG, is to kind of allow yourself to change up what the plan is and actually anticipate that replanning, right? So as opposed to making one grand schedule at the start and saying, I'm going to spend half an hour on this, and then 15 minutes on this, and then 45 minutes on this, and I'm going to spend exactly 5 minutes a day on my phone, and I'm never going to text, and I'm never going to watch Netflix. I'm just going to be a productivity king. And then the first time that doesn't happen, you suddenly feel demotivated and it all breaks down. Make some initial schedule, commit to it for a short period of time, and then let's say after 14 days, I'm going to reconsider, and very specifically plan out, let's say 14 days is the day when you make your next plan. The advantage to doing this is that when the plan has to change, as it always does, it doesn't feel demotivating, it feels motivating because it's part of your planned process. It gives you more flexibility to anticipate life being hard. And it means that you can kind of learn from the mistakes that you make over time and gradually improve the plan that you make for yourself. Yes, but there's an important caveat in here, which I almost missed, which is the only real thing that you really have to make sure to do when you anticipate kind of a replanning period after, let's say, 14 days, is make sure that on day 14, you actually reconsider and put together either a new or the same plan. Because essentially every replanning period, if you don't actually follow through, becomes a weakness of the entire process. So you have to make sure that you follow through on those dates. And then this one, kind of obvious, but important to mention, is when kind of obvious, but important to mention is when you commit to something, actually do it. Now there are, I'd say, two things that you can improve in this regard. One of them is make stronger commitments, as in commitments that are going to feel stronger to you. Group accountability is one such tool. Now you can, for example, share with your friends that you're going to do a certain thing on a certain date. And if you don't do the thing and your friends find out, then you're embarrassed, group accountability. Or you can, there's one example that is, I guess, very hit and miss or very polarizing when it comes to how much people actually appreciate it. I like anti-charities. So anti-charities is when you commit to doing something and you say that if I don't do the thing, then a certain amount of money is going to be donated to a cause that I really don't appreciate. And then with some sites that allow you to put together anti-charities, they will even let you like commit to it with your name on the donation so that you get just a little bit of extra motivation. Now, for some people, this is kind of brutal to a kind of shocking degree. But for the people for whom it works, it's very effective. Now, a slightly easier example of this is there's a platform that I really like called Beeminder, Beeminder. It lets you make commitments and then it just charges you an amount that is predetermined if you break your commitments. You can choose, let's say I want to run 2 miles every day or spend 30 minutes on this every day or whatever. And then when you log that you have failed, or especially if you use one of their integrations, which automatically tracks what you do, and you see that you have failed, then it charges you money. And every time it charges you more money. And so because losing money hurts, loss aversion is real, it keeps you, to stick to your commitments. Now, this is, of course, an example of adding extrinsic motivation to something that is intrinsically motivated. So taking something that would otherwise rely on intrinsic motivation and kind of forcing extrinsic motivation on it can often be very helpful. And that brings us to the end of this section. Any questions? And finally, let's apply the above to ML. There are some very specific examples, not many, but some very specific examples of applying the principles that we've gone through to solving machine learning problems, or rather learning to learn the field of ML. So one is, and hopefully some of this stuff is obvious, maybe some of it won't be, is start by picking a problem. Pick a problem that's going to motivate you, something that you want to learn everything you need to do to build this thing, as an example. Pick a challenge. The challenge should be interesting. Ideally, it should be valuable, financially valuable if possible. This tends to be very motivating for most students. And it should be aligned with your learning goals. So let's say that you want to learn something, you want to learn about decision trees. Then pick a problem like, let's say, assigning like loans to people, some problem that demands explainability, something where the kinds of solutions tend to align very closely with the types of, with the thing that you're hoping to learn, right? So something is seemingly obvious, but very, very often neglected is choosing a problem that has nothing to do with what you're actually hoping to learn. Next up, I said we'd come back to challenge progressions, is pick a problem that can be divided into steps that get longer over time. What will tend to happen is you'll get more and more comfortable with sticking to something for longer periods of time between, call it like, gratification periods. And you want to take advantage of this, make it so that you can make some progress in a week. And then let's say it takes 2 weeks after that to make to your next bit of progress. It takes 3 weeks after that to make it to your next bit. Not profound, and yet a very powerful tool that is often neglected. And then finally, you want some problem that you can make immediate progress on. You don't want a problem that you have to learn something just to get started. That immediate progress is when it's going to give you that initial hit of dopamine that will keep you motivated into your first, and then your second, and then your third period of learning, until finally you accomplish whatever it is to set out, whatever it is that you set out to learn, to accomplish. So to kind of summarize from this slide, because there's kind of a lot of content without necessarily being very focused, you want your learning to be driven by a problem. Pick a problem that is interesting to you personally. Pick a problem that ideally is financially valuable, or at least that you think it is. And pick a problem that you know that in order to solve it, you're going to have to learn some things that you want to learn anyway. Allow your problem to drive your learning. Let's say you want to make initial progress on the problem, and then you want to have to go, off to the side and learn something in order to make the next bit of progress. And then you achieve your next milestone, you feel successful, yay me, and then you go and learn the next thing. Allow your problem to drive your learning. And then once you've achieved the problem, show it off, get every little bit of dopamine that you can out of it, and then move on to the next problem. And then if you do this enough times, then you will soon find that you have reached some level of expertise or mastery in whatever endeavor it is that you hoped to achieve mastery in, up to and including machine learning. And this is kind of a lesson that we learned very recently, is if the project gets irreparably stuck, don't be afraid to kill it. So there's an example that we had actually. There's a project, a really, really great project, to be honest, called Cards Against AI that we spent, I think, 2 quarters working on, where essentially we were training a machine learning model to play Cards Against Humanity. And what ended up happening is all the people who started the project graduated, and then people who joined the group with no experience saw this giant project that they had no idea how to make progress on. And weeks went by, and it was very demotivating because the project was no longer a fit for the people who were working on it. And so the lesson to come out of this, and be careful with this lesson, because some people kill projects too quickly. GitHub is just full of half-done projects. That being said, if your project actually does get irreparably stuck, don't be afraid to kill it and pick a new one that better aligns with all of these goals. And then finally, I would say, find, there are great sources of challenges. Use external sources of challenges. You can use competitive sources of challenges. Remember, it's about turning intrinsic motivation into extrinsic motivation. Kaggle is a fantastic resource for this. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like LeetCode for machine learning. If you're not familiar with LeetCode, then Kaggle is essentially a platform that provides you with machine learning problems that you compete against the rest of the world on trying to solve. There can be rewards associated with them. And of course, the biggest reward of all is having your name at the very top of the list. And this is another example of binding extrinsic motivation, where you take a project and you find a way of attaching extrinsic motivation to it to keep yourself motivated. Most obvious of all, but important nonetheless, if it's not fun and it's not effective, you will not stay motivated. Now, this is sometimes read as childish. It is not. This is a principle that applies at any age, at any stage of life or learning, is your ability to stick with something is largely dependent on how well it works and how much fun you have while doing it. If you pick a project that you hate or a project that is not interesting to you, then the thing that you're trying to learn, including machine learning, if that's the case, will be something that you will start to hate. And it's a common mistake to make. People pick really ambitious projects that aren't actually that interesting to them. I would say pick a project that is interesting to you 10 times out of 10 over a project that is ambitious, or in fact, a project that is interesting to you 10 times out of 10 over a project that is aligned with your learning goals even. Because as soon as you start to make some progress, even if the progress isn't necessarily in the specific area that you wanted to improve upon, it will help you stay motivated, and it will it'll be the thing that pushes you to continue. And it is often the difference between people who come out of DG having gained a good degree of comfort and familiarity with ML, and the people who don't. And finally, for our very last question session, do we have any questions? All right, so that is the talk. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Had I had more foresight, I would have put in a slide with my contact info, but you guys can find me on LinkedIn. I suppose you can find me on Facebook, though that's not recommended because I check it about once a year. And feel free to reach out with any questions. And also, I have to mention the AI group at Developers Guild. We are always looking for new people who are excited to learn, excited to make fun projects. We are currently meeting every Sunday at 5 p.m. And there will be a link posted somewhere, if not on the website. So thanks for coming, everyone. I hope this has been enjoyable for you, and enjoy your next few minutes of free time before the next speaker.